Welcome to the Microdosing for Healing podcast. I'm your host, Casey Garrett, and together we'll be discovering and learning from inspiring voices of healers, medicine keepers, and visionaries. Every episode, we'll explore the world of health, vibrant wellness, and natural medicine for a new era of human society. Welcome to today's episode. All right. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Microdosing for Healing podcast. I'm psyched today to welcome two gentlemen you may have heard of, Kyle Bueller and Joe Moore of Psychedelics Today. Today, we're here to talk about their beautiful educational global platform in the space, what is on the top of their mind, as well as their new educational platform expansion and their fourth cohort of the Vital program coming out shortly. So to introduce these guys, Joe Moore is the co-founder and CEO of Psychedelics Today and holds over 20 years of experience in psychedelics and tech. He's a notable expert in transpersonal breathwork, board member of the Psychedelic and Pain Association and the Psychedelic Medicine Coalition, a renowned speaker on psychedelics, drug policy, and environmentalism. Kyle is the co-founder and VP of Education at Psychedelics Today, a leading expert in non-ordinary states of consciousness and mental health. With a BA in transpersonal psychology and an MS in clinical mental health counseling, Kyle specializes in psychedelic integration, spiritual emergence, and ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. He's a licensed associate counselor, certified dream shadow transpersonal breathwork facilitator, and a respected voice in psychedelic therapy, somatic psychology, and holistic healing approaches. Thank you both so much for being with us today. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Joe, let's start off with you. So Psychedelics Today has grown to become one of the most widely known, highly regarded psychedelic learning platforms around the globe. Joe, if you would, please take us back to the founding. What was your founding vision and some of the growth that has led us to today?
Founding vision was extraordinarily naked relative to where we are today. So the founding vision was we just started a podcast because we wanted to, and it was a cool way to get started working together. And the idea was getting more discussion around the work of Dr. Stan Grof into the psychedelic world, because it seemed like the research was looking really despiritualized, I guess is a way to put it, like detranspersonalized. And we were so deep in this Grof kind of worldview based on our lived experience that we thought it would be a helpful thing to do. That and preserve our teacher Lenny Gibson's legacy, and try to document a lot of his work, which we've done a lot less of than we thought we would. But we plan to do more of that when we can. And that's pretty much it. Saying like, okay, sure, well-designed clinical trials are important, but it's not the end of the story. Like there's a lot more to be discussed and experienced and fleshed out here than like really, really good science. Like that's good science is a start. It's kind of like a foundation that we can build on, and hopefully that makes a little bit of sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I love it. And so you two came together through breathwork originally. How did and when did psychedelics come into the mix?
Always kind of been there. So I started reading about psychedelics in, I think, 2001. And that's also the same time I learned about holotropic breathwork. So I discovered them kind of at the same time, intellectually reading about it. But I think, it's always kind of been there. So with Grof, there's always psychedelics. So you're going to a breathwork workshop, but you're probably going to have some interesting discussions about psychedelics at the same retreat, because most of the literature is about psychedelics, not breathwork. And so it's just part of the same thing. And a way to look at this, Casey, is that you're always dealing with the same kind of set of insights. It's just you're using different agents and practices to amplify, modulate your inner processes. Yeah. So it's always you. You're always still there. So what's the AA line? Like wherever you go, you're there. You follow yourself there. The problems follow yourself. Yeah. So similar. Yeah. Hopefully. Does that make a little bit of sense?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Kyle, yeah, I'd love for you to touch on kind of your founding and vision and the growth of the organization.
It's been a wild ride. I mean, everything that Joe said, but I was putting together this overview of like Vital and Psychedelics Today for a lecture in Vital, and that's our training program. And I started doing some digging. And Joe and I actually connected through our breathwork teachers, but there's I was at Burlington College. That's where I did my transpersonal psychology degree. We were working on a kind of self-studies master's program there. And it was going to be a master's in transpersonal psychology with an emphasis in psychedelic studies. And part of the goal was to also train breathwork practitioners through Dream Shadow. That's Lenny and Elizabeth's Gibson's organization. And there were some emails going back and forth, I think in like 2014, that I was like CC'd on with Joe. And then we ended up having a conversation, I think like early 2015 about like, should we do this program? And Joe was trying to talk me out of grad school. I was trying to talk him into grad school. And then, the school was a little bit on rocky terms by like mid 2015. They got their accreditation kind of pulled, or it was on academic probation because of what happened was that the school bought a new piece of property and it was too much and they couldn't really afford the mortgage and stuff like that. So it was just a bad business move. So it had nothing to do with the actual academics. It was just more financial. And then the school ended up tanking in 2016. So then I started going back in all these things, and Joe and I are having these conversations. And yeah, it kind of started off as this archival project. We just wanted a place to like host these talks that we might have had. It'd just be like, we want a place where we could go back and listen to our teachers and also provide that to the community. So I found this document. The first draft of what ended up becoming PT was called the Holotropic Community. And that was going to be a place for people to go to, I guess, find these talks on holotropic breathwork. And then it started to evolve. As Joe said, we wanted to kind of expand that. Joe already had 2 podcasts at that time. I didn't really know how to do any podcasting. And so, yeah, we wanted to really weave in transpersonal psychology, Groff, breathwork into the psychedelic conversation, because we were going to a lot of these conferences and that wasn't, talked about much. And which makes sense. I think they really need to stick to the hard science back then. I remember I chatted with Dr. Rick Strassman. I told him my interest in transpersonal psychology. He's like, stay away from it. Just stick to the hard science, like blood pressure, measuring what's going on in the body. And I was like, oh, that's a bit discouraging, where we're at today. Pretty wild. I never thought we would get here from just a little passion project that's really grown organically over the past few years. So it's been a fun ride, and just really thankful for all of our listeners, supporters over the years, and we wouldn't be here without everybody.
I love it. Thank you so much. I think it's so valuable to hear like the naked roots of our founding. Like there's so many incredible organizations. I know some of my most loved organizations, when I hear their founding story, Esalen is a very important place to me in my life. And it's like that founding story is 2 guys in a bathtub on a cliff. Right? Or like Spirit Rock in Marin County, it was like a guy sitting in a field with a tarp when it rained, meditating. Right. And it's like, it turns into this beautiful, beautiful thing. But I love hearing kind of the little roots. And it's so inspiring for people who are just getting into the field, who have a dream and a vision and think it's too big for them to start. It's like to hear, everything starts with a little seedling and a lot of passion. So awesome. Stick with it. You're going to have lots of ups and downs and question things, but if you have that passion and a mission, stick with it. Yeah. Gorgeous. I want to start with one of the big questions and topics right now. And I know this really shapes and defines education in the field right now. So that's the topic of harm reduction. With mainstreaming comes a lot of beautiful things and awareness, but it also brings a whole lot of other things as well. So I would love for maybe Joe first talk about how harm reduction, responsibility to humans, to environment, to the other kingdoms plays a role in kind of how you guys bring this education to the world.
So the new term of art we're trying to use is risk reduction. This is a Carl Hart wordplay thing that I learned from him. Because when we say harm reduction, it implies that the drugs can be harmful or have inherent harms when it's not really true, especially when we look culturally at like the drugs approved by the empire, alcohol, nicotine, et cetera. Like there's some substantial harm there. Yeah. So anyway, what we like to do is mimic this SSDP campaign, Students for Sensible Drug Policy campaign called Just Say No, KNOW. And, they had all sorts of other interesting phrases, like just say perhaps to drugs, like not necessarily like a hard no, but like, maybe, but let's learn some things. Like, let's start with curiosity and say, is that the right thing for me to investigate and perhaps include at some point in my life versus I'm going to do MDMA 5 times a week. And, that's fun for a week or two, kind of. But it's, it takes a lot out of you and potentially is kind of pretty risky. So, I was a super overuser for a little bit of time, but I was one of the few people in my world who was like, hey, let's kind of test, let's talk about this. What is it we're doing? What do we need to do to, recover faster or maybe do prehab, to make this like an easier situation for us. This is both MDMA and psychedelics. Generally, I don't love to include those in the same category. Yeah. And like, how do we know how strong the mushrooms are? Are we just going to eat like straight up, just go ahead and eat 3 grams? Or are we going to like test the waters to see how strong is this and how far do we want to go today? Things like that. And also having proper social cultural frameworks in place for it. If you're going to go like secretly eat mushrooms at like, 7 a.m. and then your family all comes back from church and you're still tripping really hard and like they have no context for that could be really not great for everybody involved. And so there's so many things from set and setting to, all the other ingredients here. So we like to dig into harm reduction quite a bit in our programs. I go so far as to say things like, I'm not done until we're buying LSD at Walmart without a prescription, because I really believe that there's a huge imperative for the federal government to at least allow us to keep ourselves safe. Because there's so many people dying right now from fentanyl overdoses and, this new xylazine thing that I don't actually even fully understand yet. There's so much happening in the drug market, and even mushrooms aren't safe. Everybody, like, yes, mushrooms are one of the safer ones, especially if you're growing your own. But there's this new, quote unquote, mushroom product being sold primarily in California, but some in Colorado, where people are getting really hospitalized and getting really hurt. I was kind of early on the notification chain before the CDC came out with their warning. And we're also seeing alleged mushroom product being sold with 4-ACO-DMT instead of psilocybin, instead of any mushroom whatsoever. And the reason is shelf stability. Yes, it's cheap to grow mushrooms, but mushrooms fade in potency over time. So there's, an economic imperative for some companies to be fraudulent and sell people something that they're not actually buying that has a different risk profile and drug profile. So we have to be really careful around all of these things. So that's why I work towards this conversation of safe supply, and we need a safe supply. So I think dark web is probably one of the greatest interventions in the last bunch of years for drug safety, for similar reasons. Yeah. And I hope we can do it in a more above ground capacity as time develops. I don't know if y'all saw this recently. I need to dig more into this, but the American Medical Association recently endorsed all drug decriminalization, which I think is a very robust move and something that we should be leaning into.
Gorgeous. Thanks for mentioning. Yeah. Kyle, I'd love for you to, on a similar topic, how does this inform your education frameworks?
So when we first launched a lot of our education, Joe and I were thinking like, we were newbies once and, people have access to this. Like, what type of education do people need? Where do you find this information? That was a big kind of push for us to start creating education on our platform, thinking about like people are doing this stuff already. And where do they get information? And, back then, even like when we were younger, there was really no information. Maybe you get some of the books, but like, we don't have this like robust interweb that we had, that we have now, right? So trying to find resources and stuff like that was, really tough to be like, how am I going to make smarter and safer decisions? And, I think that's where we really stand. It's like people are doing this, whether it's legal or illegal, right? And I think one of the terms that we always use, it's like, how do we maximize benefit and minimize the risk, and maybe also help to keep people out of getting in trouble with the law, right? Because a lot of people think that this is still like legal, right? I always have to remind people that it feels like psychedelics are here and it feels like it's legal, but don't take the law by pure conduct, right? Like just because everybody's doing it doesn't mean that it's legal. And I think that's the consensus with a lot of people entering into psychedelics right now, is that like there's all these underground places, so-and-so is doing this, or the amount of mushroom products I get sold on Instagram, it's absurd. And I'm just like, this is crazy. And so, if you're in this bubble, it feels like this is totally here and legal and, having safe supplies, like Joe mentioned. Contaminated mushroom chocolates are everywhere and people don't know what they're taking, right? They're taking substances where they think they know, but, they sometimes don't know what's in there. And so, I think that's what really drives us to, provide education. It's really just, I like to say, creating more folks out there that are psychedelically literate and competent. So like, we can help to create, I like to say like a cultural safety net, right? Because I think that's like the big fear that like, quote unquote, the psychedelic elders are afraid of. The 60s is going to happen again, right? Like there's going to be like media articles that pick up on, situations that aren't ideal. Perfect example, we could look at what happened in Oregon with the pilot that was, trying to shut the plane down. And I never know what was happening there. I've heard sources where it was like a few days after a mushroom trip, or he's actively on mushrooms during that flight. But stuff like that, right? People are just like, sometimes doing dumb things, taking a bunch of mushrooms and go drive, right? It's like, why do that? Right. And so I think a lot of people are worried about that with like access, but the reality is people are doing it already, and how do we help to educate people to make just smarter and informed decisions?
An extension of this topic is more people now than ever in history are using psychedelics, as far as we know, as far as we understand history. The next part is there's not proportional federal spend on research here. And I think it's an imperative. If we look at microdosing alone, like it's really incumbent on the government to really step up federal funding for this stuff. And that's a lot of what I'm doing at Psychedelic Medicine Coalition, or sorry, the people that actually work there, not me as a board member advisor, are working really hard to get funding from the feds so that we can actually understand a lot better what's happening, because, we're dealing with multi-decade information blackout effectively. It's not great for, reducing risks.
Thank you. Shifting gears to your students. So I know I get asked so often, I'm called to serve medicine and support and be in the field and be of service. And I want to do a training, but what kind of background should I go get? What will serve me best? So I love this question. And it's very, my answer oftentimes I think is unconventional, because most people think they need to go get a psychotherapy degree and that's going to best serve them in the field. And that's not the only thing. So I would love for you guys to speak to, you've seen and supported so many hundreds, thousands of students coming into the field. How would you answer this question in terms of what have the practices and modalities and background experience been most meaningful to you?
most meaningful.
So diverse.
Kind of stepping into that role.
I think there's just no way to universalize, right? It's like, oh, we only need more therapists. We only need more psychiatrists. It's like, no. We definitely need more psychiatrists. We need a few more therapists. But we don't, I think people have to judge where they're at in their life, right? Like not everybody can take on grad school or even an undergrad for that matter. And not everybody can take on state level licensure like in Oregon. So like, how do we want to think about this holistically, and how do we support somebody through their process of self-discovery so that they can land on a place that they actually, spend a bunch of time deciding like, okay, this was the right move for me? Because culture right now just says student loans, grad school. And it's almost like, I'm a little flippant about people who, their recreation is marathons. It's like, oh, well, I don't have anything else going on, so let's run marathons. I'm like, well, cool. But is that really what you want to do? Is that really what your soul like makes your soul sing? And, I think it's just like an easy, hard answer that looks healthy. And, similarly for grad school, like I think a lot of people just think it is the answer. It is an answer that can get you to a really particular place. But then people aren't really informed before they go sign up for a therapy master's about what does licensure look like? What are the restraints that I have to have on as I join this kind of guild? I think there should be a lot more informed consent before somebody spends, 20 to 80 grand to become a therapist. So I just think there's so many options. And Kyle, how do you like to think about this kind of path?
Well, I'm glad that you bring this up, because I always start with this idea of privilege. And, I hear people say, well, I did this, so you could do it, right? Like you should go down like this medical path or this psychotherapy path because that's the way it should go. If you asked me like a bunch of years ago before things have really started taking off, that was my answer. It's like, because people wanted to get involved in clinical research and stuff like that. It's like, you need that degree. But I really think about academia and the privilege of academia. I went through it and, thankfully I had some safety nets and I could really lean on family for support. And I had, the privilege of taking out loans, and I have the privilege of paying those back. But a lot of people don't, and so I really kind of view it as like, these archetypes, right? Like people have sometimes an archetypal nature to be a helper, right? Maybe they're a very empathetic listener, they're caring, really supporting, and sometimes really good at giving advice. And it could be that person that, says, my friends always come to me because I just listen to them, right? And there's a lot of those folks out there in the world that maybe can't go down the traditional route because of expenses and kind of getting into that system. So, I always like to think about like the privilege around that. And, this is why I'm excited about what's happening in Oregon and Colorado, that it's opening up an avenue for people with just a high school diploma and an additional training program. And to be able to step into this work. And I don't know, I just like to always kind of see that. I mean, I've worked with a lot of clinicians that I'm like, how are you a clinician? Some of them did it for the status. And when there is money involved, there is that status involved. Why do many people maybe become doctors, right? Maybe you make a decent salary and a decent living, right? And so it's more tied to, kind of like wealth and like status, versus like, what is, your soul's calling? Who are you as a person? And can you step into this role? And, I would trust that person more than somebody that went to, grad school or medical school because, they just want to become a doctor because there's, a good salary involved in it. And, granted, they have a shit ton of student loans too. And, I feel sorry for them too. But it's just this whole thing of academia, right? And, is there a new model for it? Can we bring forth people that do have this like, archetypal nature to heal? I think the other thing that education does also, it kind of gatekeeps it, right? And there are some pros to that, right? Maybe it keeps some people out that could really cause harm, and that could, really, cause harm to a community. So, I think, those safeguards are important. I think when one is stepping into a profession, I mean, we see this in the psychedelic world, right? How many people had one ayahuasca experience, one mushroom experience? The mushrooms told them that they're a healer, and then they start serving medicine right away. And they cause a lot of harm to people because they haven't had any sort of formal training. Maybe they don't understand boundaries a little, more, and ethics and stuff like that. And they cross a lot of boundaries and do harm. So, I think having those educational guardrails are important. But how do we make it more accessible? And, that's, I think, the $1 million question. Like, how do we make, these professions more accessible? Because just as Joe pointed out, we need more psychiatrists, right? Like, there's a lack of therapists, psychiatrists and stuff like that, because maybe people aren't going to school. It's too expensive, and stuff like that. So I don't know. Those are some of my thoughts and what I think about.
Thank you very much, both of you. That is a great segue into my next question around diversity and inclusion and accessibility, especially in terms of education. I know it's, as you grow an organization, the behind the scenes, there's so many different pressures that people don't see, right? And so you're always trying to make things accessible, but at the same time, make things sustainable. And that's an art, right? And constant, daily dance of being an entrepreneur. So I'd love for you guys to speak to, that's one of the things about you folks have stood out to me from the start, is I always see you platforming a variety of faces and backgrounds and viewpoints, which I so love. So that is a big thing in and of itself to usher in and introduce, kind of put different faces and backgrounds in positions of authority as expertise, right? I think that does a lot to undo a lot of the conditioning we have around who is an expert in our society, right? On the things. So I'd love for you to speak to that, other things that you have come, maybe edges around this topic that you would love for folks to know, and where you're at on this subject of diversity and inclusion. Joe, do you want to start?
There's this metaphor I picked up in my permaculture training way back. I don't even know when I took that, 2013, maybe 2012. And something about like resilience being intricately linked with diversity. And, the world is getting seemingly less and less resilient. And we need to figure out how are we working towards building resilience in ourselves, our communities, and the world. And I think having very diverse populations in class together is, really, really foundational there, because how is the, psychiatrist living in Beverly Hills going to understand really, in a real way, what it's like to be a, First Nations person that really wants to make a difference, has generations of peyote tradition under their belt, and lives in a really, really poor, like almost obscenely poor environment. And how else are you going to get that unless you kind of force it, right? And make it happen. And so to that end, we've been developing and self-funding, very much to our own detriment in a lot of ways, like this robust scholarship program. And every year we've been able to give away more and more, which is really great. And I hope we can do that again this year. Kyle, do you remember any of the numbers, like how much in scholarship we've done in the past?
At this point for the whole program, I think it's over like $1 million of scholarship, maybe, like maybe 1.2 in scholarships.
That sounds pretty right.
Yeah. And and so we constantly think about that. It's like, some people do, make comments about the price of the program. But the price of the program allows the program to function, to pay all the instructors, to pay for all the operations, the marketing. But it also allows us to give scholarships away, and it allows us to get people in that normally couldn't afford to be in the program. And I think that's been a really beautiful thing. And the diversity of the program, I think, sometimes really stands out. I think that's the one thing I always hear from students and from our instructors is that, like, you have a very diverse group of students learning from one another. And I just love this community. And I do love that. It's like, you have, the psychiatrist and the, yoga practitioner exchanging kind of thoughts about stuff. And sometimes, they're not aligned, and that's okay. But, there's learning in it as well. And I think somebody at one of our retreats said it, where they said, I love what you've created here with the diversity, because I don't need to show up as an MD. I can show up as a human. And that really hit me of like, whoa, because they mentioned when they've gone to like, other programs that are just strictly for maybe therapists or, licensed professionals. They're like, sometimes it just gets into a pissing match around like, their credentials. And they're like, you guys have created an environment where the human me can show up. I don't need to show up as the doctor. And I think that's something really beautiful, right? Because I think so many times we just relate to our achievements and our licenses, credentials, our, whatever that is. And that's how we identify. And sometimes we forget who we are as a person, as a human, and pulling away from all that. So that's something that I think has like really stood out, and I think is really important because it does breed, I think, a little bit of resiliency and community, right? So it's like people are able to network and, maybe reaching out to folks that they normally wouldn't have a connection with. And I think that helps to create a little bit of that resiliency. And to go back to like your comment first around like platforming people that might not have had like a big voice, that was a goal from the beginning. With Joe and I were chatting about like, who do we have on? Well, there's the folks that do the circuit, and they kind of say the same thing. And we know a lot of people that are doing really important and interesting work, whether it's in the underground or, they're just kind of like in the background. And we kind of want to like chat with these folks, right? And so that has been a big motivator of like getting people that like aren't as well known, and sometimes there are issues with that, right? Like maybe we find out down the line that maybe we shouldn't have, had that person on or something like that. But I think it is important to get more voices out there, and not just stick to the same old circuit. Again, diversity of thought and opinion.
Mm-hmm. So well said. I love it. Many years ago, I realized whether it's conferences or music festivals, to wait till the last day or go to like the last stage, the small stage, like off in the farthest field, is the best band, is the best conversation. It's the people you've never heard of that are yet to be discovered and ought to be discovered are the gold. So yeah, I appreciate that so much.
Well, they always say at the psychedelic conferences, like the best conversations happen in the hallways. And I think that was it. Like, we've met so many fascinating and interesting people that go to these conferences. We meet them in the hallways, have conversations, and we're like, whoa, you're doing some really interesting work, but you're not up on stage. And so, I think, it's important to go out there and listen to what other people are doing as well.
Beautiful. Thank you. I want to switch gears to a little speed round with you guys, if that's ready. So, Joe, let's start with you. Your fave psychedelic right now.
LSD.
Your fave psychedelic book.
LSD Psychotherapy by Groff.
Of course. Your favorite psychedelic idol or mentor?
Oh man, Lenny Gibson and Stan Groff. I'll just give you two.
Favorite musician or artist that you love to journey to?
I loved how you phrased this. I immediately went to Fish. I was like, yeah, like with 50,000 of my other friends at the same time.
Perfect. And if you are a microdoser, when you do, what is your fave microdosing medicine and protocol?
Mushrooms. I think LSD lasts too long. I like it though, but it's just I can't go to sleep with that micro in my system for some reason. And I like the Fatamin protocol, but sometimes I'll sprinkle in some of the Stammet Stack items here and there.
Got it. Awesome. All right, Kyle, over to you. Fave psychedelic currently?
Mushrooms. Yep.
Nice. Fave psychedelic book?
Ooh, man, that's a hard one. I've been thinking about this once you asked Joe. And I'm like, what is my favorite psychedelic book? The first one that actually popped up in my head, and just because it appeared at the retreat I was at last week, was Be Here Now by Ram Dass. And I just think about how much that book got me through a very, very, very difficult time in my life. So yeah, I like that book.
I
Did you
love
have it in
it.
high school?
What was that?
Did you have it in high school?
No, I found it
Okay.
after high school when I was like going through this like insane LSD trip, and I was like, how the hell do I get out of this? And it was part of Ram Dass's book and Stan Groff. Those were the two that really helped me kind of navigate that.
Right on. How about psychedelic idol or mentor?
I mean, I'm probably going to mimic Joe there because those are the two I really kind of, I think we lean on. Like when I think about what's going on, those are the folks that I think about. But maybe I'll switch it up. And somebody that I studied with that I would love to just talk more to is Kat Harrison. She's so cool.
Yeah, tell us more.
She is an ethnobotanist, and she used to be married to Terrence McKenna. But I did like a 2-week or week and a half thing with her in Hawaii around shamanism and plant medicine. And it was just so lovely to learn from her. She was just so grounded and just a beautiful soul. And yeah, sometimes I always kind of go back and think about some of the stuff that she taught during that. But she's sometimes pretty quiet in the background and somebody I'm like, oh, it'd be cool to get on the show and connect with again.
Thank you for mentioning that. I find that fascinating. I think there's so many, especially like in the 40s, 50s, 60s, the guys, the prominent guys who came up at that time, at a time when they were the only ones who were allowed to do anything. And lots of times when you get to know kind of the people behind those guys, the spouses and the families and their influence was really a big part of their presence once you peel back those layers. So yeah, thank you. Awesome. If you microdose, when you do, what is your fave medicine and protocol?
I don't microdose that much, but I do like small doses of cannabis and doing somatic work. I feel like it helps me to get my body more. So yeah, just taking like a small little hit and really kind of feeling that, and then doing some yoga, breath work, working with like the fascia and stuff like that. I feel like I can go a lot deeper.
Love that. Love it. And then last one is your fave artist or musician to journey with you.
Spangle.
Say it again.
Spangle.
Really? Okay, that's a new.
Simon Postford and Raja Ram, right?
Raja Ram.
Yeah.
Casey, do you know Spangle?
I do not. That's a new one on me.
I'll send you a couple links after.
Please do. We'll put in the show notes too for the other curious listeners at home.
Joe and I were in Jamaica on a retreat, and I did take a small dose, and we got back to the beds. I'm like, I need to listen to Spangle. I just like put on the headphones and fell asleep with them on. I'm like, that's probably like the worst thing to fall asleep to, but I was like, I need to listen to Spangle.
That's great. I'd love, while I have you two together, which is a rarity in of itself, I'd love to ask you about breathwork specifically, because I know it's been such a huge part of your personal lives, professional lives. I currently, right now, we're wrapping up one of our 6-week microdosing immersions, and I have a breathwork facilitator who is in the training to help support her practice in bringing microdosing into her breathwork facilitation, which I absolutely love because, as you know, it's a powerful combination. And then I also have another woman who, she had no experience with psychedelics. She had never even heard of breathwork coming in. She randomly came across breathwork in the 2nd week of the program and was just like, oh, I'll just check this out. I'm doing this new thing. Why don't I check out this new thing? Boom. Kundalini opening vibration, like full on somatic releases, just beautiful. She's having such an incredible experience combining microdosing and breath work together. So I'd love for you guys to share a little bit more about your passion and anything you would like about the subject and how it has informed your personal practices and professional lives as well.
People in the psychedelic space often like to go, but there's so many risks, there's so many possible harms. I'm like, well, have you heard of people getting hospitalized from Vipassana meditation retreats? Like, this is actually not uncommon that people go to meditation retreats and have to go to a psych hospital for at least a couple days. And on your Kundalini awakening thing, like, they're not exactly safe. They're not exactly necessarily what you want in your life either. And what is the book name? The writer is Gopi Krishna, Gopi Krishna, and the book was called Kundalini. And he was just a dude in India doing yoga here and there and had one. And his body was on fire for years, like very, very painful. And some people will start seeing spirits and energies and stuff. And, what do you do with that? You tell the wrong person you're locked up and on all sorts of weird meds that you might not want to be on, even though this could be a naturally emergent phenomenon. So anyway, that's my precursor. So, I love breath work. It's been my fundamental thing since probably 2003 when I started. I was doing it at least quarterly, once in a while, monthly. And it was very helpful and great prep for psychedelics. Like we were saying near the beginning, it's all one process. It's all you and your relationship to the universe, right? So this is just one way in which you have more agency than if you put something in your mouth or wherever else you put your drugs. And then there's also the aspect of being in community. And so I'm speaking more from the Grof breathwork frame. So this is like holotropic breathwork, now Grof breathwork, also dream shadow transpersonal breathwork. I think Psychia Institute is kind of a earlier schism. And, just that community support and being witnessed by peers. Even if that person's a psychiatrist, they're still, they're paddling the same boat you are in the workshop. And you might see like, oh, that's a really interesting view into what it feels like for a psychiatrist. Wow, that's insightful. So, more compassion for self and others as you're, seeing them and they're seeing you go through some pretty intense stuff. There's just so many different kinds of breath work that it's hard for me to like just say breath work as one thing. Like you've got the Wim Hof stuff, you've got the that's really activating. Then you've got all sorts of things in the yogic traditions that are both activating and really like calming and soothing. And it's a kind of biomodulation technique, and set of techniques. And breathwork, holotropic breathwork, Grof style, we like to say, it's kind of like the harder you're breathing, the harder you're flapping your wings. and the more activated you can become, which isn't really possible after you've swallowed whatever substance you've swallowed. You can't make the LSD kick in harder necessarily by, you can, but it's not like there's clear techniques for it that, we all want to teach people. But I think it's a really great, safe method that says you're the one that's the magic ingredient here. You're the really powerful spiritual thing that's making all of this happen. It's not that LSD and whatever else isn't super spiritual. It's probably just as spiritual as you, but the primary thing in your experience is you and everything that you bring to the table.
Thank you.
Kyle, anything to add on that one?
Oh yeah. A lot of stuff that you've already said. And yeah, when we talk about breath work, I think people get confused because it is an umbrella term. And so when Joe and I talk about breath work, it is really kind of from that Grof lineage. of an intensified breathing with music, with, I think what's really special that you pointed out, Joe, is the sitting aspect, and people doing this breather sitter pair, and just being able to hold space for one another is really beautiful. But when I come down to like, I guess like, why is this important for psychedelics? From your first question in the beginning, like, was it breathwork or psychedelics? I actually came to psychedelics first. I had a lot of crazy psychedelic experiences in my early 20s, and had a really hard time trying to make meaning out of it. And when I came to breathwork, I was thinking, this isn't going to be anything. I had this near-death experience. I had these psychedelic experiences. And that first breathwork experience still sticks with me. It was probably one of the most powerful things I've ever experienced. And I was completely blown away and just so curious around, like, how the hell does this work? Like, you can just like breathe in a room with people and listening to music, and all of a sudden you can, like, for me, it was like reliving my birth and near death experience and all this stuff, and full blown DMT visions, and just going, wow, this is crazy. But as Joe's saying, it's us. And so, I think that's something that it really taught me, was that we're starting to work with, I'll call it psyche. Everybody, we'll probably have all sorts of definitions: higher self, inner self, capital S self, if you're using IFS terms. But it's like, how do we start to work with psyche without psychedelics? And I think that's a really important thing. It's like, how do we get to know ourselves and know that this is all within us? Because, when people start working with psychedelics, we place a lot of agency on the substance, and then we might take everything for truth. And do we always want to listen to these medicines? Are they always right? It feels like we put it up on a pedestal. And I come back to Joe and we were doing this philosophy thing with our teacher Lenny, and had us read Plato, and I think it was Euthyphro, and they were going back in these conversations around, do we please the gods? And I think part of it was like maybe needing to kill somebody. And I could be wrong. It's been a while, but it felt like a really good kind of example of, do we always listen to the medicines, or do we always listen to, quote unquote, the gods or these higher intelligence, put it up on a pedestal and say, oh, this is always right? Or do we cultivate our own self-awareness with our own psyche and learn how to develop a relationship between the medicines and go, you know what? I don't know if I actually believe that. Let's have a conversation, And I think when we start to work with ourselves, whether it's through breath work or other inner work modalities, I think when we start to really, go in there, then we can start to go deeper in psychedelics. And the one thing that I really learned from the breathwork modality was to learn how to amplify and slow down processes. So when things get really difficult, okay, this is too much. Let me slow my breathing down. How can I use a slower kind of parasympathetic breathing to actually like calm my nervous system? Or, wow, this is really interesting material. It's challenging. I actually want to make this bigger because I want some sort of resolution with it. So maybe I might breathe into this experience, as Joe mentioned, flapping the wings. I'm going to, and, maybe I'll be able to amplify that experience a bit more. Something that Groff talks about is this concept of double bookkeeping, knowing you're on the mat, but also knowing that, you're maybe reliving a traumatic experience. And this didn't really hit me until I had an experience with ayahuasca. And, this is something I've been talking about and kind of doing for a while, but I think it really started to come to an understanding during this ceremony where I was reliving my near-death experience. I saw myself back in the CAT scan machine. I'm dying. I'm physically shaking from not having any blood in my system, and I'm reliving this. But I said, okay, this psychic narrative is unfolding. Here's like my trauma, but I'm going to stick with my body. And I started to notice my body was like, get the hell out of here, take off your, open up your eyes, go to the bathroom, distract yourself. My nervous system is going into fight or flight because I'm actually dying. Like, I need to go get help. But then I think from all my years of breath work and then learning more about somatic psychology, I was like, how do I stick with this? This is really uncomfortable. I'm going to actually let that whole narrative unfold, and I'm going to track the sensations of my body and breathe with it. And this doesn't seem like probably a big insight to many, but when I share my near-death experience, I always talk about the blissful pieces of it. And during this experience, I started to go a level deeper, and I got to this point where I got in touch with fear. And I realized I started to actually get into that fight or flight because it's activating a fear response in my body. And so I need to distract myself. I need to make sure I'm actually not dying. So, that's when I usually try to get up and walk or, want to talk to somebody. But, I think having all this experience, I was like, okay, I'm going to stick with this. I'm going to keep breathing. I'm going to pay attention to my nervous system. I know I'm actually not dying, and I'm going to let this psychic narrative unfold. And I came to this big realization that I was fucking terrified. I was never going to see my family again. I was never going to see my friends again. I was never going to have the opportunity to say bye to them. And this was it. And for me, that was a big insight because, this is content I've been working on at that time for 16 years. And I could never realize that I was actually afraid during that whole experience because I always talk about the blissful experiences. And I don't think I ever would have gotten there if I didn't learn how to regulate my nervous system with psychedelics, because it would always just blow me out too much. And so that's why I'm a big proponent of breathwork. I think it's a really great prep and integration tool. And the more that we can work with ourselves without the medicine, it's like preparation, right? I guess we'll use astronauts, for example. It's like you wouldn't just go in there without doing any sort of preparation, but a lot of people are, right? And it's like, how do we, prep the body and the nervous system for going in for these big psychic events?
Thank you.
And that's what Hatha Yoga was all about, was preparing the body for the bigger things. If we're looking at the 8 limbs of yoga, and I think we should look at a lot of ancient traditions that were doing similar things.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. So rich, both of you. I'd love to touch on, you've seen a lot, on your journey. And where we are now, I would love to hear what is kind of weighing on you, concerning you, that you'd like to kind of shine a light on and speak to right now. Joe, let's start with you.
There's so much, and what I would love to see is more unity in the psychedelic space and less infighting, and more calm, less violent conversation. So everybody could read a couple books on NVC, and we could all benefit from that. What we're about to see is a major capital deployment from big cap biotech against us in a PR framework. It's already happening. Like the PR dollars have already started coming from Johnson & Johnson, from what I understand, against us. And I think we saw a Johnson & Johnson person on the recent Lycos FDA advisory committee meeting. And they've also been deployed against other ketamine groups because they're making so much money on Spravato. So, we got to watch out. And the more divided we are, the easier we are to just knock over. So what are we unified around? Let's figure that out. And then lean into that and see if we can't work constructively on our problems and issues. And secondly, the environmental stuff. So there's too many folks consuming peyote, especially folks that don't come from Native American backgrounds. And we need to really be careful because they don't have enough peyote to go around to do their religion. And by consuming peyote, we're taking it out of their mouths. And we need to really figure out, is this really what we need? Is there a chance that LSD or mushrooms are just fine for us? Or synthetics are just fine? Because again, the magic's in our hearts and our souls. That's my frame. We don't necessarily need some exogenous spirit to sanctify us further. I think we can do better with less harm. So I think that's really essential. So please, 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 unless you have deeply sincere religious interest, please just don't consume it. There's not enough left. And there's efforts to regrow. Indigenous Peyote Conservation Initiative is one. So check that out. And then secondly, the toads, the Sonoran desert toads, Bufo alvarius, Bufo ancilius, like the species is very much under pressure. It's endangered in multiple American states. I was chatting with a number of Arizona residents, and the number of toads are really declining rapidly in their lived experience. People who have lived there for very long periods of time are seeing less and less as there's all sorts of interesting environmental impacts with our atmosphere. There's UV exposure that can sterilize eggs. There's fungus that we can introduce to their habitats to wipe out acres of these things. And for those who don't know this, a toad that secretes in part 5-MeO-DMT, and people smoke it, but at great cost to the toads and to the ecosystems. So at this point, because Mike Tyson and many others have hyped this so hard, there's now a whole cartel business that does not care about the environment and care about pushing a species to endangerment and extinction. And synthetic is just fine. This, according to the science, the synthetic is super cheap, super like much safer, and nobody has to get hurt, and you don't have to have a major environmental impact. So those are like the bigger things I'm worried about. So unity, and do we really want to have blood on our hands of making a species go extinct as a movement? I think the answer is no. Some people say yes, and they're fine with it. They actually are totally cool with that and talk about that, both in peyote and toad tradition. So not for me. I'm not for it, and I'll mostly always be against it.
Thank you.
Piggyback off a little bit of the unity stuff that Joe was talking about. I heard at this conference, I forget who said it, but they said, for substances that like open people's minds, it's really interesting how dogmatic a field can be. And it's true, because I think when we get touched by those truths or dazzled by those truths, pulling from another quote, that we become very convicted. That is truth. And how do we remain open and curious? And I think that's really important. And honoring the diversity in the field. Like, we need a healthy ecosystem. It's not one or the other. It's not just like, let's just focus on decrim and that's the way. And, the medical model is a terrible thing. And, we need a diverse field and an ecosystem. And I think, like, how do we become a little bit more open-minded about it? Yeah, it does sometimes feel like a bit of a shit show with what's going on with the medicalization and the rollout and, money coming in and biotech and the capitalization of these medicines. And, I totally get that whole concern, right? Of like, but, also the reality is that how long is that going to last if people can't afford it? The underground is going to continue to live. And we kind of see a little bit of that in Oregon. People are already saying they can't afford services. They'd rather go, do it with their friends or with a guide that's a lot cheaper. And so I always like to think, like, how do we also not trauma box psychedelics? And how do we keep psychedelics a little weird and mystical? Because that's another concern that I have. It's like, we always come back to the trauma narrative. We always come back to mental health. But psychedelics are more than that, right? People use it for all sorts of different reasons, whether it's personal insight, development, spiritual inquiries, creativity, right? And so how do we also get it outside of like the medical establishment as well? And speaking as a therapist, somebody that's trained, I'm actually not practicing as a therapist right now. But, as somebody that's trained as that, I love the mental health aspect of it. I really believe in psychedelic assisted therapy. But I think for any person that's involved in this, to be really honest with yourself and ask, how did you get involved in this? Where did your curiosity really start? Was it that you just got interested academically and intellectually by reading the research and you haven't had an experience? And that's fine. But I could generalizing here, but for the majority of people that I've talked to that are clinicians, doctors, people who are interested in this, their entry point was in nature, with their friends, by themselves, whatever that was. It wasn't in a therapy room. It wasn't with, a guide. It was with people that they really just enjoyed hanging out with and spending time with. And so, yeah, my concern is a little bit with that medicalization, that we just put everything in the mental health paradigm and we don't harness its full potential. Like something, our teacher Lenny was having a conversation with Stan years ago and was like, Stan, isn't this great? Like all this research is coming back. And, Stan's comment was like, a lot of it's been done before. We've done this in the 50s and 60s. Obviously not up to gold standards today, double-blind placebos and stuff like that. But Stan's comment was like, the real potential here is in creativity. And so, I think we really need to honor the weirdness of psychedelics, that sometimes they can just be really interesting and strange and pique our curiosity a little bit more. And so, yeah, that's one thing. And the other thing I think about too is in this realm of transpersonal crisis, is that when people are, I think the culture is really starting to open up more. When I started going to school for transpersonal psychology and I was telling people what I was going to school for and wanting to study psychedelics, everybody was like, you're nuts. What are you going to do with that? And those same people might be like, yoga teachers, they're Reiki practitioners, they're super into psychedelics all of a sudden. But with these, quote unquote, as Stan Groff would call them, technologies of the sacred, have the potential for opening people up a lot more. And so that's what I really think about, is having experiences is pretty easy. You can just, go have your experience. But the cultural integration of exceptional experience is something that I really think about, and something that I kind of talk about within Vital is creating more of this cultural safety net. Because what happens when people have these transpersonal crises, these spiritual emergencies, people are reading the research and just taking it into their own hands. And again, relatively psychedelics are safe, but there are these, experiences that people do have. And, I've had a lot of folks report it to me and seek out for support, saying like, what the hell was that? Like, that was scary. My life is completely different now. I don't know how to integrate this. And so I think, we shouldn't constantly just focus on the experience. And I think that's, again, why I come back to like breath work and stuff like that too. It's like, we put so much focus on the experience. But what happens when we come back, right? And I think that's something that we really need to think about. If we really, I think, want to integrate psychedelics and other exceptional experiences into our culture and have a healthy integration, we really need to think about that. And part of that also comes from my experience, from my near-death experience. I came back and it was just so lonely. Like, who the hell do I talk to? I feel like I'm going crazy, right? Now we're at a point culturally where that stuff seems a little bit more accepted and people are more open to explore it, which feels good. But how do we continue that? Again, because, any of these experiences can, I think, really kind of shift public perception of it. Sometimes you do see these media articles of like this celeb, like, took mushrooms and harmed so-and-so, or, this, I think the most recent one was Kat Torres and, the trafficking and being like in really in the ayahuasca community. I just watched a little BBC video on it, but, stuff like that, right? And it's like, what happens when, these experiences just inflate our egos, right? We talk about ego dissolution, but they have the opposite effect. They can really inflate people's egos and cause harm. And so, again, I just come back to the education, the harm reduction, and the importance of all that.
Thank you, both of you. I had not heard that story, but we'll be sure to put it in the show notes so that we can have some clickbait.
Yeah, I mean, definitely clickbait tips and titles. I saw some of it pop up on like Instagram. It was like influencer, like, ayahuasca influencer, like caught trafficking humans or something like that. I was like, what's going on here? This is interesting.
Well, that's our clickbait. Note it, Instagram. Oh, thank you both. So rich. So in closing, I'm so psyched to ask you both this question. In closing, I always ask all my guests, if you could suspend all reality, all gatekeeping and bureaucracy and the reality that we live in here in the Muggle world right now, and you could envision and kind of paint whatever you like, in terms of how could you envision psychedelics being incorporated into modern society right now in a way that was safe and accessible and would lead to best outcomes?
Medicine's an obvious one. I think spirituality and religion with really good containers could be really great. I think there's rites of
Passage.
Thank you. And initiations into like these new phases of life as you're no longer that child. Now you're an adult, like that kind of like marking distinct phases of your life. Back to what Kyle said, Groff mentioned to Lenny, was around creative problem solving. This is my new warpath, actually. And it's, the situation on the planet's quite dire, and we need a lot of things fixed and investigated. And I think psychedelics employed skillfully could do really well there. And this goes back to Fadiman's Palo Alto creativity research. Willis Harman was leading that research, and it was really impressive. People were solving really major problems really quickly. And Bruce Damer and others are starting a new nonprofit looking at this called the Center for Minds. And they're actually trying to pin down protocols in science around how do we actually deploy psychedelics to solve problems and do it in a rigorous scientific way so that we can scale it.
Yeah, and to just piggyback off of like what Joe said, it's like all those pillars, like I would love to see a very healthy ecosystem of diversity. So it's like where people can get those services. For somebody with pretty significant trauma to go to a place with a therapist to do psychedelic assisted therapy. Safe supply, I think, is going to be a huge thing too, right? And I know there's lots of different opinions about the commercialization of psychedelics and, kind of like the corporate aspect of that. But, it would be really interesting, I guess, going back to like Tim Leary's idea of like this driver's license model, right? It's like, could you get some training, education around safety, go pick it up and say, it's like, I want to have, some self-exploration with my friends. I necessarily don't want to do it at a service center. Being able to go pick it up and then go home. And it's like, maybe you're already more educated around creating a safer container at home. And, where do people want to do some of this stuff? It's sometimes in the safety of their own home, something that's familiar, right? So I think having safe supply is going to be really important as well. And giving people kind of autonomy. It was kind of crazy when we had Stan on a few years ago. I think we asked him the same question. And he was like, it'd be wonderful if people could just get LSD and then go hiking, go swimming. I was like, swimming, that might be a little bit dangerous, but, if you're, if you have education and, you kind of can understand the safety of it, then why can't people explore their reality? And my thing is like, if we're really concerned about physical safety, I mean, ski mountains shouldn't be operating, shouldn't be driving around cars and stuff like that. It's like, I almost died snowboarding. And it's like, that was probably the most dangerous thing than me eating mushrooms in the woods with some friends, kind of, exploring who I am. So yeah, just like a nice, healthy, diverse ecosystem where people, it's accessible. People kind of have the right to choose and how they want to do this. 'Cause it is about a relationship with a medicine, and maybe your relationship with that isn't always in a clinical setting. And maybe it's in your home with a dear friend to connect and maybe open up conversation and explore together. So it would be awesome if we get there, maybe one day. And I think if we keep pushing forward and policy keeps shifting, the research keeps coming out, I don't see why we can't get there.
I love it. Thank you so much. I find it so valuable hearing these visions and dreams, because even though they sound like when we hold them up against the reality, but so much of working with psychedelics in my experience is, people craft their intention at the start and the outset, and it's all about holding that vision and then working toward that vision together. You ultimately do get there. And so I think it's important to name these things rather than just focus on what's wrong or kind of where we are today. Mm-hmm. I love continuing to speak out what the ultimate vision is and the whole reason we're doing this work together, right? Yeah. So in closing, I'd love for you guys to talk about Vital. So you're heading into your fourth round.
Fourth cohort.
Yeah, for people who are kind of outside of the psychedelic space, but curious, could you talk a little bit about the Vital program? Because I know that's a huge part of what you guys are offering these days.
Yeah, so Vital is our 12-month program. It's a certificate in psychedelic integrative studies or integrative psychedelic studies. My dyslexia likes to switch those around. And it's really like a transformative education journey. So folks will learn about the foundations of psychedelics, harm reduction, assessment, skills to navigate the psychedelic experience, and then a real big focus on inner work and integration. And so, we really want people to focus on the integration aspect of it because, this is something we've been preaching at Psychedelics Today since we started. I think one of our first classes was called Navigating Psychedelics, Lessons on Self-Care and Integration, back in like 2017. So, this is something we just continue to focus on. It's important. And so that's also a big focus of the program. People kind of do a really deep dive in this. I've had a bunch of students over the years say like this feels like a liberal arts degree in psychedelics, where people get a very broad overview. And I think the other big piece of Vital is the community. And I think everybody has really kind of mentioned the community has been the thing that has really drawn them towards Vital. And I see it as well. And it's such a magical, beautiful thing. If you're interested in taking this 12-month journey with us, definitely check us out, vitalpsychedelictraining.com. Casey has been doing our microdosing elective for the past 2 cohorts, and you're currently in the second class. We're in the middle of our elective cycle right now. We're doing something a little bit interesting for this fourth cohort is that we'll have specializations. And so people that are enrolling in the program, you'll write kind of foundational essay around, the topic, why you're interested in pursuing this journey. And then you'll kind of pick a specialization track if you want to. It's not required for everybody. I can't remember them all off the top of my head, but we have one in spiritual emergence, microdosing, regenerative business, a depth and Jungian perspective, and I believe a trauma and somatic focus as well. Might be missing one, but those are the specializations. And so people that really kind of want to, specialize and focus on a particular area, then you'll take that and it'll be part of your final project. And so say, I want to really focus on microdosing. At the end of Vital, you do a final project, and we say there's 2 ways to kind of go about it. It's kind of based on professional integration or personal integration. So if there's something that you've really gone through, psychedelic or breathwork experiences that you want to integrate. It could be more on the personal end. A lot of people actually do more of the professional integration, redoing websites, creating retreats, creating educational programs. Some folks in my last cohort did a whole decrim initiative to try to get decrim going in their county, which is really cool. So that's on the policy and advocacy end of things, which is really exciting. I'm excited for the specialization track this year. I think that's going to be really unique and special. And Joe, I don't know if you want to add anything else there.
Just the magic. Well, there's so much magic, but one of the biggest parts that I love so much, and we spoke to it earlier, was having folks from all different walks of life learning together and being human together. And I think it's just a really healing opportunity for folks who are so disenfranchised with the world and the future, and their role in it, right? Like even physicians get disenfranchised. So like, how can we actually come back to like, are we our career? Are we our training? Those are potentially parts of us, but we're kind of different than that. And in connection and close community with folks, we can work towards uncovering that further together.
Beautiful. Well done. So props to you both and gratitude to you both. It's really, really beautiful and remarkable. I can attest, having been with your last 2 cohorts, it's a really brilliant, beautiful, inquisitive, heart-centered group of people from all over the world. So kudos to both of you for drawing so many beautiful people together. So,
thanks for being part of it.
Yeah, thank you so much. So thank you for being with us. We'll leave all the show notes and all the contacts if you're curious about Vital and want to get in touch with these two guys. We'll leave all that information in the show notes, and we appreciate you listening. And we'll see you back in a couple weeks. Thank you for listening to today's episode of the Microdosing for Healing podcast. Are you ready to take the next step? Please visit us at microdosingforhealing.com to access our free Microdosing 101 workshop. In it, you'll learn more about our diverse community, our supportive group programs, and discover if earth medicine practice might be right for you. See you in the next episode.